The fastest way to discover someone's true character is to give them power. Daniel Foster signed the final page without reading it twice. The attorney sitting across from him slid the document into a leather folder and smiled. The deal was complete. In less than 24 hours, one of the most popular family restaurants in downtown Chicago would officially belong to Daniel Foster, billionaire investor, banking executive, and one of the most influential businessmen in the country. The conference room overlooked the city skyline from the 42nd floor. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls. Millions of dollars had changed hands in less than 10 minutes. Yet Daniel barely looked interested. His attention remained fixed on a photograph lying beside the contract. The picture showed a young waitress carrying a tray of coffee through a crowded dining room. Blonde hair tied back. Black apron. Quiet expression. Claire Bennett. The attorney noticed the photograph and frowned. I thought you were buying the restaurant because it has strong growth potential. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That is what everyone else thinks. The attorney hesitated. Then why are you buying it? Daniel looked out the window. His expression remained calm. Controlled. Because I want her gone. Silence filled the room. The attorney blinked. A waitress? Daniel nodded once. A waitress. Across the city, Claire Bennett was finishing her lunch shift. She moved between tables carrying plates, refilling drinks, and thanking customers with the same soft smile she offered everyone. Most people never remembered her name. Many barely noticed her at all. That was fine with Claire. She preferred it that way. The restaurant buzzed with activity around her. Families laughed. Dishes clinked. Coffee machines hissed. It felt like any ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She had no idea her life was about to change. Back inside the skyscraper, Daniel stood and adjusted his navy suit jacket. Have the transition team ready tomorrow morning. Of course. The attorney still looked confused. If you do not mind me asking, what exactly did she do? Daniel picked up the photograph. For a moment, something hardened in his eyes. My son likes her. The answer seemed strange even to the attorney. That is a reason to fire someone? Daniel slipped the photograph into his briefcase. You have never met my son. 2 years earlier, Daniel had lost his wife. Since then, 11-year-old Lucas had withdrawn from almost everyone. Teachers, friends, family members. Yet recently, one name kept appearing in conversation. Claire. Claire said this. Claire recommended that. Claire helped him with something after school. Daniel did not trust coincidences. He especially did not trust strangers gaining influence over his son. Money had taught him a simple lesson. Everyone wanted something. Everyone. And if a waitress was becoming important to Lucas, Daniel intended to find out why. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. Before they closed, he gave one final instruction. Tomorrow morning, I want every employee present. Including Claire Bennett? The attorney asked. Daniel's expression never changed. Especially Claire Bennett. The elevator door slid shut. 42 floors below, completely unaware of the storm heading toward her, Claire folded her apron, thanked a customer, and returned to work. Most people at Harbor Street Grill believed they knew everything about Claire Bennett. They thought she was quiet because she lacked confidence. They thought she worked extra shifts because she needed the money. They thought she spent her breaks alone because she was shy. People are often comfortable with simple explanations. They require less effort, less curiosity, less attention. The truth was much more complicated. The following morning began like any other. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the restaurant. Morning sunlight poured through the front windows and painted golden rectangles across the floor. Servers prepared silverware. Cooks moved through the kitchen. Customers filled the booths along the east wall. Claire tied her black apron behind her back and started her shift. Her movements were calm, precise, familiar. She greeted regular customers by name, remembered favorite orders, smiled politely. Few people noticed what she did during the quiet moments. When the restaurant slowed down between breakfast and lunch, Claire often sat alone in a corner booth near the window. Most employees assumed she was scrolling through social media like everyone else. She was not. This morning, a thick financial report lay open beside her coffee cup. Several pages were covered with handwritten notes. Numbers filled the margins. Market forecasts, risk assessments, regulatory observations. Claire turned pages carefully, studying every detail. A young server named Ashley approached her table carrying a tray of glasses. She laughed when she noticed the report. You know, normal people watch videos during their breaks, right? Claire smiled without looking up. I never claimed to be normal. Ashley glanced at the pages. I cannot understand a single word in that thing. Most people do not want to. Do you? Claire finally looked up. Her blue eyes softened. I like understanding how things work. Ashley shook her head and laughed again before returning to work. The conversation ended there. Like most people, she assumed it was simply an unusual hobby. Across the restaurant, an elderly customer entered through the front door carrying a worn leather briefcase. Claire noticed him immediately. Before he could reach the counter, she was already bringing his coffee. Good morning, Mr. Callahan. The old man smiled. You remembered. 2 creams. No sugar. His smile widened. One of these days I am going to test you. Claire set the coffee down. You already do. Every Tuesday. The old man laughed. Nearby customers smiled at the exchange. It seemed ordinary, small, forgettable. Yet there was something unusual about Mr. Callahan. He had spent 30 years as a banking executive before retiring. For nearly 6 months, he and Claire had shared conversations during his weekly visits. Not about weather, not about sports, about economics, investments, banking regulations, market behavior, subjects nobody expected a waitress to discuss. This morning was no different. Mr. Callahan opened a newspaper and pointed toward a headline about a major upcoming bank offering. People seem excited about this one, he said. Claire glanced at the article. For a brief second, something crossed her face. Concern. Then it disappeared. Excitement does not always mean safety. The retired banker raised an eyebrow. Interesting answer. Claire simply returned to work. She never explained further. Never tried to impress anyone. Never announced what she knew. Yet as she walked away, Mr. Callahan watched her thoughtfully. Because he had spent decades evaluating talented people. And every time he spoke with Claire Bennett, he became more convinced of the same thing. She was hiding an extraordinary mind behind an ordinary uniform. Outside, a black luxury sedan slowly pulled into the parking lot. Claire never saw it. But inside the vehicle sat Daniel Foster, watching the restaurant through tinted glass. Daniel Foster built his reputation on a simple principle. Trust numbers, not people. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not manipulate. Numbers did not disappoint. That belief had helped him build one of the fastest-growing financial institutions in the country. It had also helped him survive the most difficult years of his life. After his wife passed away, Daniel buried himself in work. Meetings replaced conversations. Quarterly reports replaced family dinners. Success became easier to manage than grief. From the outside, his life looked perfect. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him visionary. Competitors called him dangerous. Yet every evening when he returned to his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, he faced the same reality. His 11-year-old son barely spoke to him. That afternoon, Daniel sat behind a massive walnut desk inside the headquarters of Foster Financial Group. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline behind him. Several executives discussed projections for an upcoming public offering expected to generate billions of dollars in market value. Charts filled large presentation screens. Analysts reviewed forecasts. Daniel listened quietly. Every detail mattered. The upcoming launch represented years of preparation. Across the table, a senior executive finished speaking. Everything remains on schedule. Daniel nodded. Good. Another executive smiled. The market response has exceeded expectations. Yet Daniel seemed distracted. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting beside his laptop. It showed Lucas standing on a fishing dock years earlier, smiling beside his mother. Daniel looked away almost immediately. The memory still hurt. His phone vibrated. A message from the private investigator he had hired several weeks earlier. Daniel opened it. The report contained exactly what he had requested. Information about Claire Bennett. Employment history. Educational background. Financial records. Social activity. Everything appeared surprisingly ordinary. Waitress. No criminal history. No significant debt. No suspicious connections. Nothing explained why Lucas trusted her. Daniel frowned. Something felt incomplete. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The office door opened. Lucas stepped inside. The executives immediately fell silent. Daniel's expression softened. Hey, buddy. Lucas nodded politely, but remained near the doorway. Daniel motioned toward an empty chair. Come sit down. Lucas walked over and sat quietly. The executives resumed their discussion. For several minutes, Lucas listened without speaking. Then his attention drifted toward a notepad resting beside Daniel's laptop. Without thinking, he picked up a pen and started drawing. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. The meeting continued. Numbers, forecasts, strategies. Yet 15 minutes later, Daniel realized Lucas was not listening to the executives at all. He was drawing flowers along the edge of the paper. Small flowers, delicate flowers. The same type Claire had once shown him how to sketch after one of his visits to the restaurant. Daniel recognized them immediately. His jaw tightened. After the meeting ended, the executives left the room. Silence returned. Daniel looked down at the drawing. Claire taught you that? Lucas nodded. Daniel kept his voice calm. You seem to talk about her a lot. Lucas stared at the paper. She listens. The answer landed harder than Daniel expected. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel asked, and I do not. Lucas looked away. The silence that followed gave him all the answer he needed. Daniel felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. Regret. Frustration. Maybe both. Yet instead of examining the feeling, he focused on what he understood best. Control. Solutions. Action. He stood and grabbed his suit jacket. Tomorrow morning, he would take ownership of Harbor Street Grill. Tomorrow, he would finally meet Claire Bennett face to face. And tomorrow, he intended to find out exactly why a waitress had become more important to his son than he was. The next morning, Harbor Street Grill opened 30 minutes later than usual. Employees stood in small groups throughout the dining room, speaking in hushed voices. Rumors had spread overnight. New ownership, corporate restructuring, possible layoffs. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but everyone felt the tension. The familiar warmth of the restaurant seemed replaced by uncertainty. Claire arrived 5 minutes early, just as she always did. She tied her apron, greeted the kitchen staff, and started preparing coffee stations. Nothing in her routine changed. Yet she immediately noticed the atmosphere. Nervous glances, forced smiles, people checking their phones every few minutes. Ashley hurried toward her carrying a stack of menus. Please tell me you know what is happening. Claire shook her head. I know as much as everyone else. That is impossible. Ashley lowered her voice. You always know things. Claire smiled faintly. Not this time. Before Ashley could respond, the front doors opened. The conversation stopped almost instantly. Silence moved through the room like a wave. Daniel Foster entered first. His navy suit looked perfectly tailored. Behind him walked attorneys, managers, and several corporate representatives carrying folders and tablets. The contrast between the billion-dollar executive team and the family restaurant could not have been greater. Daniel paused near the entrance and surveyed the room. His expression revealed nothing. Claire continued arranging coffee cups. She did not rush toward him. She did not stare. She simply continued working. Daniel noticed immediately. Everyone else seemed intimidated. Claire did not. 10 minutes later, the entire staff gathered near the dining area. Daniel stood at the front beside the restaurant manager. Morning sunlight poured through the windows behind him. Thank you for being here, he began. His voice was calm, controlled, professional. As of yesterday, Harbor Street Grill officially became part of Foster Hospitality Holdings. Nervous glances spread through the crowd. Daniel continued. Some operational changes will occur over the coming months. However, today's purpose is observation. I intend to understand how this business operates. Several employees visibly relaxed. Claire remained silent. Daniel's eyes moved across the room until they settled on her. Claire Bennett. Every head turned. Ashley's eyes widened. The kitchen manager looked confused. Claire calmly looked up. Yes. Daniel walked forward. The room felt smaller with every step. How long have you worked here? Almost 5 years. Do you enjoy it? The question seemed harmless. Yet something about the way he asked it felt different. Like a test disguised as conversation. Claire noticed. Most days. A few employees smiled nervously. Daniel did not. Most days. Claire nodded. Every job has difficult days. Daniel studied her for several seconds. Interesting answer. The silence stretched. Everyone could feel the tension even if they did not understand it. Finally, Daniel spoke again. My son visits this restaurant. Claire's expression remained unchanged. Yes, he does. And you spend time talking with him. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Daniel was no longer discussing restaurant operations. He was discussing Claire. Specifically Claire. Sometimes, she answered. Why? The question landed heavily. Claire noticed Lucas standing near the entrance behind the corporate team. Quiet. Watching. She understood immediately. This was not about business. It was about a father. A worried father. She could have defended herself. Explained everything. Instead, she simply said, because he seemed like someone who needed someone to listen. The room fell silent. Daniel expected excuses. He expected nervousness. He expected apologies. What he received instead was honesty. And somehow, that irritated him even more. The silence lingered. Long after Claire finished speaking, employees shifted uneasily. Some stared at the floor. Others glanced between Daniel and Claire, trying to understand why a routine ownership meeting suddenly felt so personal. Daniel kept his eyes on her. He had expected hesitation. He had expected someone eager to defend themselves. Instead, Claire stood calmly in front of an entire room full of people and answered as though she had nothing to prove. That confidence bothered him. Not because it was disrespectful, because it felt genuine. Lucas remained near the entrance. His hands rested in the pockets of his jacket. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at his father. Daniel noticed immediately. "You seem to care a lot about my son," Daniel said. Claire glanced toward Lucas before answering. "I care about people." Daniel folded his arms. That is a very convenient answer. A few employees exchanged nervous looks. Claire did not react. It is also the truth. The room became quiet again. Daniel felt frustration building beneath his calm exterior. He had spent weeks trying to understand why Lucas trusted this woman. Yet every answer only created more questions. Before he could continue, Lucas suddenly stepped forward. The movement surprised everyone, especially Daniel. "Dad." The single word immediately drew attention. Daniel turned. "What is it?" Lucas hesitated. Public conversations were not easy for him. Everyone in the room could see that. Yet he continued anyway. "She never asked me for anything." The statement landed heavily. Daniel stared at his son. Lucas looked down briefly before speaking again. "She never asked who you were. She never asked about money. She never even knew you owned a bank until somebody told her." The room remained silent. Daniel felt dozens of eyes watching him now. For a moment, he did not know how to respond. Lucas rarely volunteered opinions. When he did, people listened. Claire looked uncomfortable. She clearly had not expected Lucas to defend her. Daniel noticed that too. It would have been easier if she enjoyed the attention. Easier if she seemed manipulative. Instead, she looked like someone wishing the conversation would end. The restaurant manager finally cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue discussing operations." Daniel barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "Tell me something," he said. "If you care so much about helping people, why work here?" Ashley looked horrified by the question. Several employees frowned. Claire simply thought about it for a moment. "Because I like it here." Daniel shook his head slightly. That cannot be the whole answer. A faint smile touched Claire's face. Most answers are bigger than people expect. For the first time all morning, Daniel found himself without a response. The sentence sounded simple, yet something about it lingered. Across the room, Lucas quietly smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but Daniel saw it. And suddenly a troubling thought crossed his mind. What if the person he had spent weeks investigating was not influencing his son at all? What if she was simply giving Lucas something he had not received in a very long time? The meeting ended minutes later. Employees returned to work. Customers began arriving. The restaurant slowly returned to normal. But as Daniel watched Claire move through the dining room, greeting guests and refilling coffee cups, one uncomfortable realization followed him. The more he learned about her, the less certain he became that firing her was the right decision. Daniel stayed at the restaurant long after the employee meeting ended. Officially, he was there to evaluate operations. Unofficially, he was trying to understand Claire Bennett. The problem was that every answer seemed to create two new questions. Throughout the afternoon, he watched from a corner booth near the window. Customers came and went. Orders moved in and out of the kitchen. Claire worked continuously. Yet nothing about her behavior matched the image Daniel had created in his mind. She never sought attention, never lingered near wealthy customers, never treated important guests differently from anyone else. At 3 o'clock, the lunch crowd faded and the restaurant grew quiet. Daniel noticed Claire carrying a coffee refill toward Mr. Callahan, the retired banker she greeted every Tuesday. The elderly man smiled as she sat briefly across from him. They spoke for several minutes. Daniel could not hear the conversation, but he noticed something unusual. Mr. Callahan pulled several printed financial documents from his briefcase and slid them across the table. Claire studied them, not casually, carefully. Like someone reviewing material she genuinely understood. Daniel frowned. Most waitresses did not spend their breaks discussing financial reports with former banking executives. His curiosity deepened. Later that afternoon, after Mr. Callahan left, Daniel quietly approached the table. A single page remained behind. He glanced down. His eyes narrowed immediately. The page contained notes about regulatory exposure and market valuation models. Handwritten comments filled the margins. Intelligent comments. Sophisticated comments. Daniel recognized the terminology because he had spent 2 decades in finance. His gaze moved to one particular note. The observation was accurate. Extremely accurate. In fact, it highlighted a risk factor many junior analysts often missed. Daniel looked across the restaurant toward Claire. She was clearing dishes near the kitchen entrance. The discovery unsettled him. That evening, after returning to his office, Daniel opened the investigative report again. This time he focused on the educational section. Earlier he had dismissed it. Now he read every line. Halfway down the page, something caught his attention. He read it twice. Then a third time. Claire Bennett. Undergraduate studies in finance and economics. Academic honors. Top percentile performance. Program not completed. Daniel sat back slowly. The report offered no explanation. No degree. No graduation date. Just a sudden departure from the university several years earlier. He stared at the page. The waitress carrying coffee refills. The woman discussing market risk with a retired banker. The employee who seemed completely uninterested in impressing anyone. None of it made sense. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Lucas stepped into the office. Daniel closed the report. Everything okay? Lucas nodded and sat quietly in a nearby chair. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Lucas looked up. Did you fire her? Daniel hesitated. The question felt heavier than it should have. Not yet. Lucas seemed relieved. The reaction did not escape Daniel. Why does that matter so much? Lucas thought about the answer. Because she never talks to me like I am broken. The room fell silent. Daniel lowered his eyes. He suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Everyone else in Lucas's life had been trying to fix him. Counselors, teachers, family friends, even Daniel himself. Claire had done something different. She had simply treated him like a person. Later that night, Daniel returned to the report one final time. His eyes settled on Claire's incomplete finance education. Questions filled his mind. Questions he intended to answer. Because for the first time since buying the restaurant, he was no longer certain that Claire Bennett was hiding a motive. He was beginning to suspect she was hiding a story. 2 days passed. Daniel could not stop thinking about Claire Bennett. That fact alone irritated him. He was preparing one of the largest financial events in his company's history. Investors expected updates. Regulators required documentation. Analysts worked around the clock. Yet somehow a waitress from a family restaurant continued occupying space in his mind. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel returned to Harbor Street Grill without announcing his visit. The lunch rush had ended. Only a handful of customers remained. Claire was seated alone in her usual corner booth near the window. A coffee cup rested beside an open notebook. Daniel paused before approaching. What he saw surprised him. Pages filled with calculations, financial models, market projections, handwritten observations. The work looked more sophisticated than material produced by some analysts in his own company. Claire noticed him standing nearby and calmly closed the notebook. Good afternoon. Daniel sat across from her without being invited. You studied finance. It was not a question. Claire simply nodded. For a while. You never finished. No. Daniel waited for an explanation. None came. Finally he asked, why? Claire looked out the window. The answer seemed to require thought. Life changed. Daniel frowned slightly. That is all. A faint smile appeared. Sometimes that is enough. Once again she answered without truly explaining. The habit frustrated him. Yet he could not deny his growing respect for the way she carried herself. Most people rushed to justify their decisions. Claire never did. Daniel leaned back. You understand financial risk. Some. More than some. Claire said nothing. The silence became its own answer. For several moments neither spoke. Outside, traffic moved through the afternoon streets. Sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Inside the restaurant, the quiet felt strangely comfortable. Then Daniel made a decision. I am reducing staff next week. Claire looked at him calmly. No surprise. No panic. I see. Your position is being reviewed. Ashley, who happened to be passing nearby, nearly dropped a tray when she overheard the conversation. Claire simply folded her hands on the table. "That is your decision." Daniel studied her face carefully. Nothing changed. No anger. No fear. No attempt to negotiate. The reaction unsettled him more than any argument could have. "You do not seem concerned." Claire glanced toward the window. Worrying about something before it happens rarely improves the outcome. Daniel almost laughed. "You always answer questions like that?" "Only the difficult ones." For the first time, a genuine smile appeared on his face. Brief. Unplanned. Then it vanished. He stood and adjusted his jacket. "You may not have this job next week." Claire nodded once. "Maybe not." Daniel took a step toward the exit. Then Claire spoke again. "Good luck with Thursday." He stopped immediately. Slowly, he turned back. "What did you say?" Claire picked up her coffee. "I said good luck with Thursday." Daniel stared at her. Every executive in his company knew tomorrow's significance. Thursday was the final review meeting before the public offering. Months of preparation depended on it. Yet that information was not public. Not completely. "How do you know about Thursday?" Claire looked directly at him. Her expression remained calm. "I read the news." The answer sounded reasonable. Yet something felt wrong. Or perhaps too right. Daniel left the restaurant carrying an uncomfortable feeling he could not explain. Hours later, sitting alone in his office reviewing documents for the next day's meeting, he heard Claire's words again. "Good luck with Thursday." The sentence lingered in his mind long after midnight. And when Thursday finally arrived, Daniel would discover why. Thursday began before sunrise. The headquarters of Foster Financial Group buzzed with energy long before the city fully woke up. Executives arrived carrying laptops and briefing folders. Attorneys reviewed final documents. Analysts monitored market activity from giant screens covering entire walls. Months of preparation had led to this day, the final review meeting before the public offering. If everything proceeded according to plan, the company would move one step closer to the largest expansion in its history. Daniel stood near the conference room window overlooking downtown Chicago. Coffee sat untouched beside him. Despite the importance of the meeting, his thoughts briefly returned to a restaurant across town. "Good luck with Thursday." Claire's words had followed him all morning. He found himself annoyed by how often he remembered them. At exactly 8 o'clock, the meeting began. Senior executives filled the room. Financial projections appeared on large screens. Legal teams reviewed compliance updates. Everything seemed routine, familiar, predictable. Then, 40 minutes into the presentation, something changed. A junior analyst raised his hand. His voice sounded hesitant. "There is a discrepancy." The room became quiet. Daniel looked up immediately. "What kind of discrepancy?" The analyst swallowed. "A reporting issue involving projected exposure in one of the expansion portfolios." Several executives exchanged confused looks. The chief financial officer frowned. "We already reviewed that portfolio." "I know," the analyst replied. "But these numbers do not reconcile." Within minutes, additional reports appeared on the screens. The atmosphere shifted. Calm confidence gave way to concern. Teams started comparing documents. New spreadsheets replaced old ones. Conversations became faster, more urgent. Daniel watched silently as the problem grew larger. What initially appeared minor began affecting multiple projections. Then another issue surfaced, followed by another. The room felt noticeably different now. Nobody was smiling. 2 hours later, the meeting paused. Daniel stood alone near the window while executives continued investigating. His phone remained silent. The city stretched beneath him. Traffic moved through the streets. Yet inside his mind, one sentence echoed louder than everything else. "Good luck with Thursday." He turned back toward the conference table. Analysts were still searching for answers. Frustration spread through the room. The timing made no sense. How had this remained hidden until now? Then another memory surfaced. Claire sitting beside a notebook filled with calculations. Claire discussing market risk with Mr. Callahan. Claire studying financial reports during lunch breaks. Daniel felt a strange chill. It was ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. Yet he could not ignore the possibility. By noon, the meeting officially entered crisis mode. Not because the company faced disaster, but because uncertainty had appeared where certainty was expected. Investors hated uncertainty. Regulators hated uncertainty. Markets hated uncertainty. Daniel finally walked into his private office and closed the door behind him. For several moments, he stared at the skyline. Then he opened the investigative report again. Claire Bennett. Finance and Economics. Academic Honors. Exceptional Performance. Studies interrupted. His eyes moved to a handwritten note from the investigator. Former professors described her as unusually gifted in risk analysis. Daniel read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Slowly, he lowered the report. The silence inside the office felt heavy. Across the city, Claire Bennett was serving lunch, refilling coffee cups, and carrying trays as though Thursday were no different from any other day. Daniel looked at the clock on his wall, then at the report, then back toward the conference room where executives still searched for answers. For the first time since purchasing the restaurant, he found himself wondering whether the person most capable of helping his company was not sitting in a boardroom at all. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside Foster Financial Group felt completely different from the confident optimism that had filled the building that morning. Conference rooms remained occupied. Analysts moved rapidly between departments. Attorneys reviewed documentation for a second and third time. Nobody was panicking, but everyone understood the same thing. A problem that should have been identified months earlier had somehow survived every review process. Daniel stood in the executive conference room listening as another analyst explained the latest findings. The exposure model assumes a performance trend that no longer exists. The analyst pointed towards several highlighted figures on a screen. The numbers are technically correct, but the assumptions underneath them are outdated. Daniel folded his arms. How much does that affect valuation? The room became quiet. Nobody wanted to answer. Finally, the chief financial officer spoke. Enough to create serious questions. Daniel nodded slowly. Serious questions. Investors had a way of turning serious questions into serious problems. The meeting continued. Yet Daniel found himself paying less attention to the discussion and more attention to a growing suspicion. He remembered the page left behind at the restaurant. He remembered Claire's notes. More importantly, he remembered one specific comment she had written in the margin. At the time, it seemed like an academic observation. Now he was not so sure. Without saying a word, Daniel left the conference room and walked to his private office. He opened a locked drawer and removed the page he had quietly taken from the restaurant table 2 days earlier. He laid it beside the current report. Then he compared them line by line. The realization arrived gradually. Then all at once, Claire had identified the exact category of risk now causing problems. Not directly, not by naming the company, but through a series of observations about market assumptions and exposure models. She had seen the vulnerability before his entire executive team. Daniel sat back heavily in his chair. For several seconds, he simply stared at the documents. The waitress carrying coffee trays. The woman he intended to fire. The employee he assumed knew nothing about finance. Somehow she had recognized a weakness that highly paid professionals had overlooked. His office phone rang. Daniel ignored it. His attention remained fixed on Claire's handwriting. Then another memory surfaced. Excitement does not always mean safety. She had said that to Mr. Callahan while discussing a newspaper article about the public offering. At the time, the sentence sounded philosophical. Now it sounded like a warning. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. The Chicago skyline stretched beneath a cloudy afternoon sky. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely humbled. Not because a mistake existed. Mistakes happened. What unsettled him was realizing how confidently he had judged someone he did not understand. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The chief financial officer entered. "We need another review session." Daniel nodded, then surprised himself by asking a question he never expected to ask. "What would you think if someone outside the company identified the problem before we did?" The executive frowned. "Depends on the person." Daniel looked back at the page covered in Claire's handwriting. What if that person was a waitress? The executive actually laughed. Then he noticed Daniel was serious. The laughter disappeared immediately. Several minutes later, while the company continued searching for solutions, Daniel picked up his car keys. Across the city, Harbor Street Grill was serving lunch. Claire Bennett was probably carrying coffee cups and taking orders. She had no idea that the man who planned to remove her from the restaurant was now driving toward her with an entirely different question. Not why she spoke to his son, not why she worked there, but how she had seen something his experts could not. The bell above the restaurant door chimed softly as Daniel stepped inside. The afternoon crowd was lighter now. A few customers sat near the windows. Coffee cups rested beside half-finished meals. Everything appeared normal. Yet Daniel carried a completely different perspective than the man who had entered the restaurant several days earlier. Back then, he arrived looking for a reason to fire Claire Bennett. Today, he arrived looking for answers. Claire was standing near the register helping a customer when she noticed him. Her expression did not change. No surprise. No concern. She simply finished the conversation and walked over. "Good afternoon." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Do you have a few minutes?" Claire glanced toward the manager. After receiving a nod, she led Daniel toward the same corner booth near the window where she often spent her breaks. The notebook was there again. Closed this time. A coffee cup sat beside it. Daniel remained standing for several seconds before sitting down. He placed several documents on the table. Claire recognized them immediately. Financial reports, market analysis, regulatory projections. The same type of material she often discussed with Mr. Callahan. "You left notes on a report earlier this week," Daniel said. Claire looked at the papers. "Maybe. Those notes identified the exact problem my executive team is trying to solve right now." Silence settled between them. Claire neither looked impressed nor uncomfortable. She simply listened. Daniel leaned forward. "How?" Claire folded her hands. "Which part?" The answer caught him off guard. "The exposure assumptions." She nodded slightly. They were based on historical conditions that no longer existed. Daniel blinked. The explanation arrived instantly. No hesitation. No need to review the documents. "You knew that from a newspaper article?" Claire shook her head. "No." "Then how?" She looked toward the window where afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass. "Patterns." Daniel frowned. "Patterns. Most people focus on numbers. Numbers matter. But patterns explain where numbers are going." The simplicity of the answer somehow made it even more impressive. Daniel sat back. Across the table, Claire appeared completely unaware of how unusual this conversation was. Or perhaps she simply did not care. "Why are you working as a waitress?" The question finally escaped before he could stop himself. Claire smiled faintly. "You already asked me that, and you did not answer." For a moment, she remained silent. Then she looked down at her coffee cup. "My father became sick during my final year of school." Her voice stayed calm. "Medical bills arrived. Tuition became impossible. Life changed." Daniel remembered the phrase immediately. Life changed. The same answer she had given before. Only now it carried meaning. Claire continued. "After he passed away, I needed work. The restaurant offered me a chance when nobody else did." Daniel listened quietly. There was no self-pity in her voice. No bitterness. Just facts. Honest and simple. "You never went back?" he asked. "No." Another silence followed. Then Daniel slid the financial documents across the table. "My executives cannot agree on a solution." Claire looked at the reports but made no move to touch them. And Daniel hesitated. The next sentence felt strange coming from someone like him. A billionaire. A chief executive. A man accustomed to giving answers, not requesting them. Yet he said it anyway. "I would like your opinion." For the first time since the conversation began, Claire looked genuinely surprised. For several seconds, Claire simply stared at him. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background. Plates clinked. Customers talked. Coffee machines hummed. Yet none of it mattered. Daniel Foster had just done something nobody in the restaurant would have believed possible a week earlier. He had asked for her opinion. Not as a waitress. Not as an employee. As someone whose judgment he respected. Claire glanced down at the reports spread across the table. Then she slowly opened them. Her eyes moved across the pages. Revenue projections. Exposure models. Regulatory assumptions. Daniel watched carefully. He expected her to study the documents for several minutes. Instead, less than 30 seconds passed before she stopped turning pages. There. She tapped a section near the middle of the report. Daniel leaned forward. "What about it?" Claire slid the document closer. "Everyone is looking at the numbers. Nobody is looking at the assumptions behind the numbers." Daniel immediately recognized the phrase. It echoed what she had already said. About patterns. Claire continued. "The model assumes customer behavior will remain stable during expansion. And it will not." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Claire pointed towards several supporting reports attached to the analysis. "Because your projections are based on historical confidence levels. Those confidence levels changed almost 9 months ago." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Keep going." Claire turned another page. "Your analysts adjusted for market growth. They adjusted for interest rate movement. They adjusted for regulatory pressure." Her finger stopped on a chart. They never adjusted for customer migration patterns. Silence. Daniel stared at the page, then at the chart, then back at the page again. Slowly, realization appeared in his expression. Claire was right. The factor seemed small on its own, yet it affected multiple assumptions simultaneously. The discrepancy spreading through the company's projections suddenly made sense. Daniel felt a chill move through him. Not because the answer was complicated, because it was simple, painfully simple, the kind of oversight that often hides in plain sight. Claire sat back. If you update that assumption, the rest of the model changes. Daniel immediately reached for his phone. Within seconds, he was calling the chief financial officer. The executive answered almost instantly. Did you find something? Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the report. Run a revised model using customer migration adjustments from the last 9 months. A pause followed. Why? Daniel looked across the table at Claire. Just do it. 20 minutes later, Daniel and Claire sat in silence while waiting for the results. Claire sipped her coffee. Daniel checked his phone every few minutes. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, a billionaire executive found himself anxiously waiting for an answer connected to a waitress. Then the phone rang. Daniel answered immediately. He listened without speaking. His expression changed. First surprise, then disbelief, then something very close to admiration. Are you certain? He asked quietly. The executive on the other end responded. Daniel slowly lowered himself into the booth. Thank you. The call ended. Claire already knew the answer before he spoke. Daniel stared at her for several seconds. The entire discrepancy disappeared. Claire nodded once. No celebration. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. Daniel shook his head slowly. Around them, customers continued eating lunch without realizing that a major financial problem had just been solved from a corner booth inside a neighborhood restaurant. For the first time since meeting her, Daniel no longer saw Claire Bennett as a mystery. He saw something much more remarkable. A person whose value had been invisible only because nobody bothered to look closely enough. Daniel remained seated long after the phone call ended. The reports still lay scattered across the table between them. Outside the restaurant windows, afternoon traffic moved steadily through the city. Inside, life continued as normal. Customers ordered lunch. Servers carried trays. Coffee brewed behind the counter. Yet for Daniel, nothing felt normal anymore. A woman he intended to dismiss had just solved a problem that threatened months of preparation inside a billion-dollar company. Claire quietly closed the financial report and slid it back across the table. The gesture seemed to signal that the conversation was finished. Daniel was not ready for it to end. Do you understand what you just did? He asked. Claire looked toward the dining room. I helped answer a question. Daniel almost laughed. You saved my executive team days of work. Claire shrugged lightly. The answer was already there. Once again, she seemed completely uninterested in taking credit. Daniel found that more remarkable than the solution itself. Most people spent their lives searching for recognition. Claire appeared perfectly comfortable without it. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Daniel reached into his jacket and removed a business card. He placed it on the table. Come work for me. Claire blinked. Genuine surprise crossed her face. Daniel continued before she could answer. Analyst. Consultant. Strategy team. Pick the title yourself. Claire looked down at the card, then back at him. You are serious. Completely serious. Daniel leaned forward. You belong in a boardroom, not carrying coffee cups. The answer came immediately. I disagree. Daniel stared at her. Why? Claire glanced around the restaurant. Ashley was laughing with a customer near the counter. The kitchen staff moved between stations. Mr. Callahan's favorite booth sat empty by the window. Familiar faces. Familiar routines. Familiar people. This place mattered when my family needed help, she said softly. I do not forget things like that. Daniel listened carefully. The explanation revealed more about Claire than any investigative report ever could. Loyalty, gratitude, character, values impossible to quantify on a spreadsheet. He respected that. Then something unexpected happened. Lucas entered the restaurant. Daniel had completely forgotten they planned to meet later that afternoon. The boy spotted Claire immediately and smiled. It was still a rare sight. Yet lately it appeared more often. Lucas walked over. Did you fix it? Claire looked confused. Fix what? Lucas pointed toward the reports. The thing making my dad grumpy. Daniel shook his head and laughed despite himself. Claire smiled. Maybe. Lucas looked pleased with the answer. Then he sat beside his father. The simple interaction made something clear to Daniel. Claire had not changed Lucas through advice, or expertise, or authority. She had simply shown up consistently, patiently, quietly, the same way she approached everything else. Daniel reached into his jacket again and removed another document. This one was different. A formal check. A very large one. He slid it across the table. At least accept this. Claire looked at the amount and immediately pushed it back. Daniel frowned. Why? Her answer was calm. Because helping someone is not a transaction. The words settled over the table. Daniel stared at her. For years he had lived in a world where nearly everything carried a price. Services, expertise, advice, time. Yet Claire operated according to a different logic entirely. One built on principles instead of profit. And in that moment, Daniel realized the most valuable thing she had given him was not the solution to a financial problem. It was a lesson about what true worth actually looked like. The following Monday, every employee of Harbor Street Grill gathered in the dining room before opening. The atmosphere felt familiar, yet different. News had already spread that the restaurant's new owner planned to make an important announcement. Staff members stood near booths and tables, whispering quietly among themselves. Ashley looked nervous. The kitchen manager looked confused. Nobody knew exactly what to expect. Claire stood near the coffee station wearing the same black apron she had worn every day for the past 5 years. To her, it felt like any other morning. Then the front doors opened. Daniel Foster entered. This time he arrived alone. No attorneys. No executives. No assistants carrying folders. Just Daniel. The room fell silent. He walked to the center of the dining area and looked around. His eyes eventually settled on Claire. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel turned toward the employees. Last week, I purchased this restaurant believing I understood everything I needed to know. The room remained completely quiet. I believed success meant recognizing talent faster than everyone else. I believed experience gave me good judgment. He paused. I was wrong. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. Daniel Foster was not a man known for public admissions. Daniel continued. I came here prepared to remove someone from this restaurant. The silence deepened. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. Claire lowered her eyes slightly. Daniel looked directly at her. I judged a person before I understood her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I assumed I knew her story because I knew her job title. His voice remained calm, but the sincerity behind it was impossible to miss. That mistake cost me something important. Claire watched quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. Fortunately, it also taught me something important. He stepped closer. Claire Bennett helped my son when I could not. Lucas appeared near the entrance at that exact moment. He smiled when Claire noticed him. Daniel continued. She identified a financial problem my executive team failed to see. She solved it without asking for recognition. Without asking for money. Without asking for anything at all. The employees stared in disbelief. Ashley looked as though she might faint from shock. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded document. He handed it to Claire. Confused, she opened it. Her eyes widened slightly. It was not a termination notice. It was a scholarship fund. Fully financed. Created in her father's name. Designed to help working adults return to college when life interrupted their education. For the first time since Daniel met her, Claire seemed unable to find words. The dining room remained silent. Daniel smiled. You once said that most answers are bigger than people expect. Claire looked up. Daniel nodded toward the document. I finally understand what you meant. Emotion softened her expression. Not because of the money. Not because of the recognition. Because someone had listened. Truly listened. Lucas walked over and stood beside her. The simple gesture said everything. Daniel looked around the room one final time. Then his eyes returned to Claire. Why did you never tell anyone how talented you are? The question hung in the air. Claire glanced at the employees she had worked beside for years. Then at Lucas. Then at Daniel. Finally she smiled. A quiet smile. The kind that carried wisdom rather than pride. Because intelligence does not become more valuable when people notice it. The room fell silent again. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. The kind that remains after a truth has been spoken. Outside, morning sunlight filled the restaurant windows. Inside, a billionaire who thought he could by control had discovered something far more valuable. Respect. And sometimes the greatest wealth in a room belongs to the person everyone almost overlooked.